We're in the '06 library building our app, and we got up to, in the last lesson, we got up to login. So we're going to look at lazy loading. Lazy loading, this uses the intersection observer API. For example, we have a bar across here, which would normally be at the bottom of the page, but when things come into view, they get loaded. So we see we have an image here, for example, as it's coming in, suddenly it gets loaded. We can do the same for a blog post, for example. If we just cross the line, I'm not going to go into the intersection observer by itself, but if we look here at the network tab, and if we refresh and come up top and refresh the page, what we'll see, as if we're coming down here for the network request, is as we're coming here, we're loading in the page. Let's just see all. Let's just rechange that. As we come into the next post, there we see that post 4. There it's loading in a random image. And as we keep going down, as it crosses the line. Now when we look at that component, and this is in lazy load, we're using the lazy load component here. Let's just have a look at the page. The page we're actually loading is called lazy.html, and that actually references lazy load component and lazy load image in number 11. Lazy load component, they're roughly the same. If we look at the lazy load image, what we're really doing is using the intersection observer API here. We're watching when things cross. We can set parameters, whether the white width of the page, the height, when it crosses this threshold, what percentage of the threshold needs to be crossed so that it comes into it. I'm not going to go into intersection observer API, it's well documented, but we can add these things in here. And all we're doing is we're building into this component this sort of lazy load feature. There is a new attribute called loading, and you can have lazy or eager or none. I think it's not available across all browsers, but this is the way that we can create a lazy loading image. And in the same way with a lazy loading component, it's the same kind of pattern that we've been seeing all along. Here it's just making the request, but here we're actually just observing for this component when it crosses the line. And when it crosses the line, we have a callback that we actually use. And we can see here, so you can look at search up on the intersection observer API, but this is just showing how web components can contain quite a lot of useful functionality that we can just build in. So whenever somebody wants to actually place these on a page, all we need to do is basically load that tag. So if we come down here, we can see we're loading in the scripts on this particular section here, and we have our component called WP lazy load. We just set the attribute of the picture we want. We put them as many times as we want. If we're doing a post, I'm using the lazy load component, web component, setting the ID of the post. And as you can see, you can do all of this here. You could add these dynamically as well, as we saw before, but dynamically load in these. So this is a way really of increasing network performance using the lazy load API. Now, if we go back to the top, when we go into the offline, if you notice, we've got basically a whole category of posts. And if we change to category 25, we get 25 here. We scroll down, we see them all. If you remember on our index page, what we did is we actually loaded in this information here. So if we go into IndexedDB, we're loading in the information here. There are two pages, load and read, that use these components. The difference between the load and load local is this is using a local data set in our data folder. This is actually going out to the web. So basically, without going into the detail of them, because it uses IndexedDB, but we have a little kind of class helper to access IndexedDB, the transaction processes. There's some very good libraries. Jake Archibald has a very good IDB library that you can use that has more functionality in it. And for example, in the load component, we basically just kind of load in the data here. And if you notice here, in our component, we're loading in category 1, category 2. If we go into them, we can see it's what we've done before. We're loading all the posts. The difference this time is we're using the IndexedDB to store them there. And if we come into the application, we can see that they've been stored here. So let's just move that across so we can actually see it. So if we come in here, we can see our database. They're all posted in here. And one thing you can do is you can clear storage, clear all site data. If I now go back to the home index, because this is where all the categories are loaded, we'll see this have an arrow that changes. There we see it, and now all that information is being stored. So one advantage of this, for example, when we're in offline, for example, if I go to F12, because it's now the reading and the writing of this is using the IndexedDB. If I go to the network and go offline, we can see that these still work because they're using IndexedDB to access the data. It won't work on a page refresh because we need a service worker for that, but we can add that in. It's a small file which I cover in my PWA course, and you can basically see now how we can use this kind of concept of loading IndexedDB even just for performance, because this is now instant. It's just the device speed. It's no network request to load in a whole category of posts. So scrolling down, see they're all changing. So if we close that down, and we should now be, if we refresh the page, we've now gone through all these different sections. We've seen the UI and the back to post down here. We've seen how we can make categories. We can also, if we look in here, if we come back to the show all posts, you can do different versions where you pass in a range of posts. So let's click on this one, show all post range. If I open this up, this is producing a range of posts, but I can change the range. There we see it changed. And essentially what I'm doing here is I'm setting a range as a JSON stringified object to make it easier to parse and to avoid multiple requests if we have separate attributes. And if we actually look at the component itself, it just destructures out the values and then basically gets all those posts. And I'm using a local data set here, but it's actually looping through them. So there'd be more efficient ways of doing this, but it just shows you how you can change the kind of attributes that you use. For example, with this component, I'm passing in the URL that I want. So if this was for a client or something like that and they wanted to change the URL that they were going to, you could do that here. And we're clicking buttons here. So if we open this one up, let's see what this one does. I can change the category by accessing a public method in that component. This was just an example of showing the public method. We're not passing it via attributes, we're just changing it by accessing a method in that web component. It's just a JavaScript class, and we can change the URL accordingly here using the set attributes. So here we are using the attributes to change the web component, but we're using a public method to actually change the attributes on the component on the page itself. So it's very much the component is changing its own attributes based on a method that's been called from outside. As I said before, that's not a system we use because that's kind of components talking to components. Though in this case, this is a page talking to a component through its public method. So if we go back and have a quick look at that again, we basically got a button, and when we click on that, we access our web component by a query selector or show all post URL. This now essentially kind of maybe almost makes an instance of this object. Effectively, that's what we're doing. And then we can then access, because we've got a reference to it, we've got a reference to its public method. So more accurately, it's probably referencing that web component and can access its method, but it's almost like it's creating an instance of it, and we can access the public method or its methods on that component. So there's a great many different examples in here. The repo has it all. If you want to contact me, you can contact me through my GitHub account. The email is there. But I hope this shows really the power of web components, how we can actually create a great deal of functionality. Let's come back here and go into the site. There we are. So we've seen how we can load into IndexedDB, we can use dynamic loading of web components and dynamic loading of the scripts, we can do categories, we can kind of display a whole range of information in many different ways by passing attributes. We can connect to our web component through attributes, through its methods, events, and children components emit events with a payload that go to the parent. We've seen blog, we've seen login. So we've done get, we've done post, we've done offline access, we've done using some intersection API. We can see really we can power the really nice web components that when we come to a page like this, and if we view page source and we scroll up, we can see that when we're writing, we're literally just going to be, that's not such a good example. Let's go back. If we actually go into that page and go into index, we can see we're almost writing our website in a very declarative way. We're just adding, in the same way that we add HTML tags, we're adding our own custom HTML tags, but our whole site functionality. So in a sense, you can just recreate new powerful sites, and it's just a matter of styling and how each of the components interact with each other. So I hope you enjoyed this. Some things I will admit, when I was talking about the blog, talking about how these all interact, I did a bit of hand waving there. I didn't go into detail, but if you follow through the code, you can begin to see how it's done. It's one way of doing things. I tend to prefer props down, events up, but this gave an example of showing details between setter and getter between components via the page. And the most important thing to remember is JavaScript classes are just syntactic sugar. There is a library documented on the GitHub repo called Hybrids, which doesn't use classes, just uses the prototype. And to remember, there are no private methods or properties in JavaScript. So although we may try and make them seem private with the underscore, everything can be accessed. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this and see you soon. Bye bye.